that everything is being recorded. Okay. So welcome everyone to this new session of the seminar Connecta amb Mitjana. Today we have with us Laure Domont, who is PhD researcher in Avignon with doctoral thesis on the Lordship of Montpellier during the 13th and 14th century. It's a bit much more specific than what I'm describing, but I'm afraid to make very terrible mistakes when describing it. So she will probably do it much better. You have the floor for this 40 minutes of presentation. Thank you.
Okay. It's always good for the presentation. You can see it. Okay, so I begin. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of the seminar for the invitation, and especially Rogerio Tostes and Sergi Tella. What I'm going to talk about today is based on my doctoral research. That is the reason why it's still an ongoing project, and there will be a lot of assumptions. I am studying from a comparative perspective administrations of the Lordship of Montpellier by the kings of Aragon, Majorca, France, and Navarre. In the context of this seminar on institutions and collective representations, this presentation aims to examine the consequences of the multiple powers present in the Lordship of Montpellier, and also their competition. This can be seen in the multiplication of institutions, but also in the privilege links with either the Lord of Montpellier or the King of France. In fact, this question of power representation arises in the case of the Lordship. It will have an impact on the development of institutions because the political and administrative context is very specific. As you can see on the map, the Lordship of Montpellier is located here in red, in the south of the Kingdom of France. And the chronological framework in which I study it begins at the start of the 13th century. In 1204, Mary, Heiress of Montpellier, married Peter II, King of Aragon. The Lordship enters the Iberian sphere and will experience its first administration under the Crown of Aragon. This administration ended in 1276, and after this date, the Crown of Aragon separates part of these domains to form the Kingdom of Majorca, to which Montpellier will be attached until 1349. In that year, Philip VI, King of France, purchased the city and the bailey of Montpellier. This French administration lasts until 1365. And finally, the Lordship returns to the Iberian sphere with the Navarrese administration. Thus, between the early 13th century and the end of the 14th century, 9 lords from Aragon, Majorca, then France and Navarre succeed each other in governing the Lordship of Montpellier. However, this administration do not exercise control over the entire territory of the Lordship. There is a division of territories and rights. This forces the lords to share their power either with the Bishop of Maguelone or with the King of France. These lords then establish institutions that define the legal and fiscal framework of their lordship, but it remains primarily an entity within the Kingdom of France. It is very interesting to study the consequences of this administration and cohabitation on the development of the lordship and its identity. When we think of Montpellier in the Middle Ages, one of the first things that comes to mind is its consulate. Indeed, the question of the city's strong institutional identity has already been extensively explored by historiography. In this regard, we can mention the work of Pierre Chastain, who analyzed the urban government of the city with its consulate established in 1204. As well, there are the works of Vincent Chalais, who highlight the local chronicle, the Petit Talamus, which contributed to the construction of a consular and local identity by using Occitan as the official written language. While the issue of the city's institutional identity seems to be settled, what about the lordship at the same time? Indeed, the term Lordship of Montpellier from the early 13th century to the end of the 13th century encompasses numerous dependencies, castra, and wilaya, whose affiliation to the lordship varied over the centuries. Also, not all of these localities can be considered communities in the strict sense. Some can be studied through the documentation that has been preserved. This thus offers a new perspective on institutional identities and collective representation within the lordship. This lordship and its administrations have been studied notably by Jean Baumel and Hideyuki Katsura. However, either their works do not cover the 2 centuries of remote administration, or they primarily rely on archives preserved in Montpellier or within the Kingdom of France. This study can be carried out by cross-referencing of sources preserved by the kingdom that administered the lordship, and as well as those kept locally. However, the elements preserved in the archives for these communities are not always the ones we are looking for. Most of the documents we find are records of homage or sales of rights and lands related to these communities, but there are few documents initiated by these communities themselves, unlike the case of Montpellier. Fortunately, we have rural charters preserved either in the departmental archives or in municipal archives. It is also possible to complete this corpus by using episcopal archives. Thus, by cross-referencing the documentation, it is possible to approach over the long term and at different scales how this power-sharing arrangement evolved and how they shape the different institutions and collective representation of the lordship. The aim is to understand how the context of multiple representation of power within the lordship leads to the multiplication of institutions and groups seeking recognition from these powers. Due to the long phases of composition and recomposition of the lordship's territory, it is necessary to analyze it at different levels. It will begin with the scale of the wilaya, castra, and communities, and then I will examine the jurisdictions and conclude with the scale of the royal districts. But before that, I will try to, the first scale at which we can observe the multiplicity of powers is the lordship. In the lordship is that of the rural communities. These communities developed during the 13th century and became institutionalized at the end of the 13th century and the beginning of the 14th century. Is it interesting to ask how the rural communities, just like the Montpellier consulate, will take advantage of this power-sharing arrangement? Indeed, what particularly interests us in our case, given the unique context of the administrations, is to see what kind of relationships are maintained with power and how the communities leverage the plurality of powers by putting them into competition. Before that, we need to take a closer look at the organization of these communities. As you can see in the map, at the beginning of the 13th century, the Lordship of Montpellier included around 20 localities. These localities are described in a document from 1204, formalizing the lands included in the dowry of Marie of Montpellier when she married Peter II of Aragon. From the beginning of the administration, it became clear that some of the rural communities have special privileges as they form the core of the lordship, its indivisible domain. Indeed, in 1205, Peter II of Aragon confirmed to the inhabitants of Montpellier the indivisibility of the lordship, particularly of the castrum and the city of Montpellier, as well as the castra and city of Latte and Castelnau. These two cities then have a special status and privileges. The men of Latte and Castelnau have the same legal rights as the inhabitants of Montpellier. This special link is also reinforced by the fact that the bailiff of Latte and Castelnau report directly to the bailiff of Montpellier. Similarly, the consuls of Latte are dependent on the consul of Montpellier. Clearly, the status of Latte and Castelnau is very special. They benefit from an almost direct connection to the city and therefore have privileged links. But what about the status of the other communities? And what links do they have with the seigneurial or royal power? In the 13th century, the kings of Aragon and later of Majorca enlarged the territory of the lordship by accumulating fiefs among the small surrounding lordships. Many castra and wilays were granted and 15 charters of oaths and tributes have been preserved. This is the first step. Next, in 1349, when the King of France purchased the town and bailey of Montpellier, he added the possessions of the former episcopal port, the rectory. Part he had purchased at the end of the 13th century. You can see on the map the locations that were added. In 1371, the counties of Cesnon, Servien, and Tézan joined the lordship, which was then administered by the King of Navarre. All of these aggregations resulted in the lordship at the end of the 14th century, which consisted of about 50 locations. It stretched from Cesnon in the west, Castries in the east, Ganges in the north, and Frontignan in the south. It appears that these communities eventually belonged to the same lordship of Montpellier, but they were originally developed under different powers, with which they may have retained some connections. Not all of the places within the Lordship developed a syndicate or consulate, but what shows the study of the development of communities conducted by Hideyuki Katsura is that when this happens, is it from the middle of the 13th century. This is later than what we can be observed in neighboring counties. This appearance of syndicates can be observed from the middle of the 13th century. Poppian set up a syndicate in April 1249, Amblas in August 1265. And we still have to wait to see the development of consulates. The only exception is that of Lat in 1247, which, as we saw, enjoyed a special position. The first rural consulate appeared in Frontignan in 1281, and later a consulate emerged in Le Pouget between 1217 and 1300. Poyan established a consulate in 1308 and Pignan in 1327. The interest of these communities is to be quickly recognized by the power. Thus, under Aragonese administrations, James I in 1264 recognized the establishment of a syndicate in Amblas. Then, in 1304, under Majorcan administration, the community of Frontignan had its consulate recognized, but not by the Majorcan lord directly, but directly by the King of France at the community request and in exchange for 1,000 livres tournois. We soon find a first competition of powers at the beginning of the 14th century, which allows the community to see its privilege confirmed by two authorities. Alongside the formal concessions and recognitions of these institutions, the confirmation of privilege directly to the consuls is also a good testimony to this relationship and the recognition of these institutions. Under Majorcan administration, for example, the consuls of Le Pouget have certain rights regarding goat grazing confirmed by the king's lieutenant. Then, in 1316, Sancho, king of Majorca, granted a charter of new freedoms to the inhabitants of Poyan. Particular links between communities and the King of France are also observable in the context of the 100 Years' War. For example, during the 100 Years' War, the community of Poyan offered money for the ransom of John II, King of France. And in a context where the rural communities of Languedoc are particularly affected by the devastation caused by the large mercenary company, they turn to the king who can protect them most effectively. As shown by the protection charter of Pignan, obtained after the destruction he had suffered in 1362. So even if this work is still in progress, it is interesting to compare the context of institutionalizations, the privileges of these communities, and the links maintained by the Lord in each configuration, to see if the formation of rural communities, which develop in parallel, differs according to the administrations. Another interesting aspect about this lordship within the Kingdom of France, but administered by lords from Aragon, Majorca, or Navarre, is that these rural communities belonging to the same lordship can be recognized by both powers and seek to maintain relations with both the King of France and the Lord of Montpellier. Two remarks on this subject. So far, this situation has already been observed in the case of the Montpellier consulate, which, aware of the general context of these administrations, also plays on this competition of powers. This situation of balance between seigneurial and royal power, but above all between different kingdoms, is used to benefit from privileges. On the other hand, this observation is not surprising, since from the middle of the 13th century, the lords of Aragon and Majorca recognized that they held the Lordship of Montpellier in fief from the King of France. At the local level, there are links between rural communities and the various powers that administer them. This collective representation at the political level enables them to be present before the Lord, Bishop, or King, and thus to be recognized by them. However, the community level is not the only scale on which collective representation can be observed. These rural communities are also represented within other administrative and judicial circumscriptions that enable them to share the same rights and be recognized globally by the Lord, the jurisdictions. This is the second level of analysis. These institutions are interesting to analyze because they are created by the powers to administer the Lordship more effectively. We therefore need to analyze the way in which communities are integrated into them and how they recognize that they belong to them. This level is also relevant because in the case of Montpellier, it's perfectly illustrated the sharing and competition of powers within the Lordship. Thus, you can see on the map that the Lordship was made up of 3 jurisdictions from the middle of the 13th century. Bailly in red, the Lords' jurisdictions within the city of Montpellier. Barony in blue, the Lords' jurisdictions outside the city. And the Rectory in grey, episcopal jurisdiction until 1293, and then royal jurisdictions. Bailly and Rectory appear at the beginning of the 13th century, while the barony was formalized in 1258. Indeed, during the first half of the 13th century, the lands and dependencies outside the city had no real denomination. It wasn't until December 10, 1258, in an amnesty charter issued by James I, which you can see partly transcribed on the slide, that the Lord's possessions outside the town were included for the first time under the term baronia. As identified by Hideyuki Katsura, this term replaces terra dominum districtus, which had previously been used in the same context. This barony appears in the very specific context of a weakening of lordship, of a lord power, of a seigneurial power. In the middle of the 13th century, the King of Aragon was involved in the local conflict with the consuls and the consuls of Montpellier, and with the conflict with the King of France in the context of the Treaty of Corbeil. Following these two events, the Lord seems to have implemented a reaffirmation of his power in Montpellier by naming for the first time the jurisdictions over which the lordly is exercised outside the city. As you can see from the maps, these jurisdictions are very closely interwoven and will therefore be the subjects of many conflicts. Fortunately, the acts of regulation and the agreements that stem from them make the lands Castra and Wilaya visible. For example, following an agreement on January 5 in 1273 between Bishop Béranger Frédol and King James I, this agreement defines the civil boundary between the barony and rectory. This boundary crosses the city, continues outside, and reserves a small part of the inner city space under the jurisdiction of the rectory, as you can see on the map. The deed establishing this boundary also details the numerous confrontations separating the two territories, giving a clearer idea of the lordship in the 13th century, which at the time was made up of some 40 castra and wilaya. What is more interesting is to see that these institutions persist over the time. Thus, we still observe these three jurisdictions in 1374 in a documented titled Liber estime ville tam partis antiquae quam nove Baiuli rectorie et baronie montis Spesuli. Created jointly by the commissioners of King of France and King of Navarre, this document was intended to serve as evidence in the land valuation case. The document begins as follows. For the purpose of clarity and a summary statement of the proceedings in the estimation or valuation to be made regarding the villa, rectory, bailey, and barony of Montpellier, transferred to the King of Navarre and subsequently assigned to him as compensation. It should be notably noted that in such a matter, there are three main parts. Is it clear that these jurisdictions formalized in the 13th century do not disappear over the centuries or with each new administration? On the contrary, they seem to crystallize, fixing in time the separation of rights and power, and ensuring that the functioning of the lordship is not overly disrupted by the change of lord. Now, what interests us is the use of these jurisdictions. These institutions can be mobilized by lords or their representatives to remind, when addressing these communities, to which jurisdictions they belong, especially in the context of conflicts. For example, in 1286, a conflict broke out between Ponce de Canillac, the abbot of Agnan, and Brémond de Montferrier, lieutenant of King James II of Majorca. The dispute concerns the rights of each party in several locations, and both men have interest in these areas, and their heritages overlap. To resolve these conflicts, an investigation is conducted, and the decision is accepted by both parties. The agreement shows how these locations are defined as belonging to a particular institution. Thus, according to the document, the town of Selneuve, terminio territorio et pertinentis eius dem, cum dicta villa et eius territorium, is recognized as Sint Ifrateram et Baroniam Montis Pesulani. Moreover, it is acknowledged that justice belongs to the prior of the Church of Saint-Amand de Tella, except in case of violence, and at this time, which fall under the authority of the king and the Lord of Montpellier and his successors, because they said the castrum and town of Saint-Amand de Tella sit in terra et baronia Montis Pesulani. This reference to jurisdictions is also found in the context of a feudal recognition for castri on May 30, in 1331. Gilbert de Pierrefort, a knowledge holding in fief, tanquam a domino montis Pesulani et vestris successibus in dominatione et baronia montis Pesulani predictum castra de castris. In view of the deeds I have analyzed so far, the reference to jurisdictions seems absent from rural communities documents. This would suggest that this institutional identity is integrated by the communities, particularly for the justice on which they depend, but it's not used by them or between them. This remains to be verified in further research. After examining how the Lord used these institutions, we must ask how these institutions are experienced and mobilized on a daily basis by the inhabitants of the communities. This can be done, for example, through the study of the justice compositions. A register of accounts kept for the year 1374 under the Navarrese administration show which courts of justice are mobilized. As you can see, in the case of Guillaume and Jean from the castle of Frontignan, who were accused of beating up a man from the same place, they are allowed to settle a composition before the judge of the barony, the jurisdiction on which the place depends. In another document, John Donne from Murviel must pay a fine of 8 francs imposed by the court of the barony for grazing his sheep on the lands of Omlas. This is a particular case, as John Donne was condemned because accidentally or intentionally his animals grazed on other nearby land belonging to Omlas and possibly belonging to John Gilly, but not included in the settled grazing land. Murviel is in the rectory, but the crime of which he is accused took place in the territory of Omlas, which depends on the barony, hence the mobilization of his courts. It is therefore possible to attest that the justiciable of the seigneury and of these rural communities mobilized the jurisdictions and on which they depended. This proves both that they are aware of belonging to this institution and that they recognize its legal authority. Clearly, these 3 different jurisdictions will give rise to a number of different justices, distinguishing the rights and privileges of the communities within the lordship. Finally, the last level that can be observed within a French administrative framework is that of the seneschalty. The seneschals of Beaucaire and Carcassonne became instruments of monarchical standardization after the Treaty of Meaux in 1229. And these institutions allow the King of France to exercise this power over the lordship, as the seneschals have their own court of justice and are responsible for distributing subsidies on behalf of the king. Above all, these institutions are the power intermediary, the seneschal, within whom the institutions must deal. If you look at the map, you can see that the seigneury, in red, straddles 2 seneschalty, Beaucaire, Nîmes, and Carcassonne. And if you zoom in, you can see how the dependencies of the lordship are divided between these 2 jurisdictions. We know this distribution for the barony part thanks to the 1374 land appraisal book presented above. They said the document said, this barony is part of the Seneschalty of Beaucaire and part of the Seneschalty of Carcassonne. From the Seneschalty of Beaucaire, the following castle and places belong, and there are the enumeration. Next, the following are part of the Seneschalty of Carcassonne, followed by the enumeration of places. These institutions are interesting because they allow us to study the relationship with the Lordship of Montpellier in two different configurations. One, where the jurisdictions depend on the King of France, the Rectory, and the other when the jurisdictions depend on the Aragonese, Majorcan, or Navarrese law. Indeed, after 1293, the King of France bought back the episcopal chair, and his local officers were the seneschals, who were also French officers, which made the royal administration more efficient. Conversely, the lords of Aragon, Majorca, and Navarre, and their representatives also had to interact with the seneschal of the French king. To facilitate recognition of his authority in the area under the control of the Aragonese and Majorcan lords, the King of France granted them certain privileges, while at the same time recognizing the institutions already established there. In 1284, Philip III granted certain justice privileges to the King of Majorca in the city, land, and all the barony of Montpellier and other lands depended on it. The King of Majorca obtained that appeals against legal decisions in his lordship lands would not be heard by the seneschals, but directly by the Parliament of Paris. What's more, the seneschals will not be able to intervene in these lands to dispense justice as long as the King of Majorca or his representative is prepared to dispense justice according to local laws and customs. This means that they must respect the way justice is dispensed in the lands of the King of Aragon or Majorca. At the level of these jurisdictions, the seneschals thus position themselves as guarantors of the rights of justice, and they can intervene in conflicts between jurisdictions, not just to defend the interests of the King of France. For example, they ensure that the royal jurisdictions respect the others. In 1280, there is a conflict between the seneschal and the bishop regarding the failure of the King of France to respect the boundaries of the jurisdictions. Then he reminds that the rector of Montpellier has no jurisdictions over the land of the King of Majorca, and therefore the king's seals must be removed from his land. He also has the king's gallows removed, which were placed within the jurisdictions of the Bishop of Maguelone. This shows that he recognized, on behalf of the King of France, the jurisdictions of the Bishop and the Lord of Montpellier. Finally, the seneschals also issue orders at community level, notably in 1352, when the seneschals of Carcassonne reminded the royal officers of Gignac that they had no knowledge of the affairs of Le Pouget. The seneschals, who act as representatives of royal power in the lordship, are also confronted with these divisions and power competitions, which they arbitrate and attempt to protect at different levels. From what we can observe, they also contributed to the recognition of these institutions by the French royal power, enabling it to position itself as a superior authority. In conclusion, in the Lordship of Montpellier, between the beginning of the 13th century and the end of the 14th century, we observe the formation of communities and their institutionalization. However, at the scale of the Lordship, these dependencies are primarily conceived as part of a jurisdiction. In fact, even when there is a change from 2 or 3 jurisdictions, the functioning of the Lordship is not disrupted, and the institutions, rectory, bailey, and barony, enable rapid integration when rights change. However, for this to be possible, these institutions must have clear territorial limits and jurisdictions to integrate the places that depend on them, and then to be mobilized by these communities. There are therefore 3 frameworks of solidarity and justice with specific rights, obligations, and privileges. These collective representations are thus constructed from the outside by the Lord, the Bishop, and the King, before becoming lived frameworks, at least for the justice. In short, it seems that at the level of the Lordships, the jurisdictions created by the Lords made rural communities invisible, and that the jurisdictions become the institutions and collective representations of reference for the Lord at the legal, political, and economical levels. Communities, on the other hand, are only occasionally mobilized by the Lord or King to assert his authority and sovereignty. The multiplication of institutions in the Lordship therefore seems to be a direct consequence of the many powers that coexist there. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you for the presentation, which I certainly found very interesting as in advance. I don't know, now that we are 3, if Vincent has any question. If not, I will go with my terrible knowledge of late Middle Ages situation, even though I found many ideas really interesting. I think that this process of institutionalization running, I don't know if to say against or at least with this relationship with the very different existing powers is very interesting, and probably I think that makes very interesting in studying the story of Montpellier as you're doing. One of my questions is probably related to how little I know on late Middle Ages, but you mentioned, I think it was in the 9th or 10th slide, lieutenant of the King of Majorca, I think it was. And I was interested in knowing how this representative of the different lordships or the different lords change during these very turbulent and this change of powers that happen, especially during the 14th. I don't know if they kept part of their power, if they had to accommodate to new situations, if they were displaced by, I don't know, kingdoms of never taking power in Montpellier. But I think it's very interesting how in a space where it's far from every king governing it, power has to be delegated, and how delegate of power really act or interact with different powers is something that is really great interest to me. I don't know also which kind of representatives are in 13th and 14th period, which are the titles or the exact function. I mean, functions of the institutions, but I don't know if you can really trace a bit of what happens when those power shift occur.
Okay, yes, it's a very interesting question. The representative of the Lord in the Lordship are nominated by the Lord himself. Under the administrations of Aragon, and Majorca, it's a lieutenant, and we can observe under the administration of Aragon that it's in the beginning Catalan, and they are the word is in Spanish in my head, but not in English.
No problem. Say it in Spanish. Luckily I understand Spanish better than English.
And we can see an alternation between lieutenant Catalan and lieutenant who are from the Lordship and or from Montpellier particularly.
Okay.
If I didn't say a word, the time of each lieutenant is 2 years.
Okay.
And this system with it's obliged by the Lord of and the King of Aragon will be succeed during the administration of the Lord of Majorca. The real changement is when the King of France bought Montpellier. And now, at this time, it's not a lieutenant, it's a governor.
Yes, governor.
Gobernador.
Yes.
And the term of governor, it's maintained by the King of Navarre.
Okay.
So they are rupture before the king bought Montpellier and after. And we see there are many representatives of powers under the administration of Aragon and Majorca, and just few representatives, few governors in the administrations of France and Navarre. And this the time of the political lieutenant, the administration of the lieutenant is in a larger period.
Okay. Okay, thank you. I think that's a very, very interesting topic, and it's at least interesting to know that there were that kind of changes, and even you said there were fewer in the later period of after being bought by the King of France and Navarre, but their original extraction remains also similar in that they are coming from Montpellier. I don't know if. Well, firstly, Catalan and local.
In the administration of the King of France, there are officers, French officers. And what is particular on the administration of the King of Navarre is that the governor can be at the first time officers of Normandy, because at this time the King of Navarre has territory in Normandy. Okay. And we see after this governor a man who was Navarrese. So okay. There are no after the 1349, we don't see local lieutenant.
Okay. I suppose that's something important to be expected, but those interrelationships between local powers and kingly powers are very interesting to just try to know about them, especially or at least I find this interesting. And in fact, as I said in earlier chronology, but I try to work on these ideas. I don't know. There's another thing that I was very interested too, which is this idea that the fragmentation of power and jurisdiction, though it was a process of growing institutionalization and everything growing fixed, allowed certain space for negotiation for those local communities, which if I would say generally I find this idea appealing that the agency of those communities when really interacting with kings is just a very interesting strategy. And I don't know if you find different attitudes. For example, some communities who were much more closer or developed growing relationship with the king or the lord, or if there were some that keep those much more ambiguous status and just follow this path, or if there's a more homogenic approach of people just trying to benefit from their ambiguous position.
Yes, I think at this time there are differences for the links between the communities and the king, and it depends of the jurisdictions. But I didn't pronounce myself now because I think it's also a problem of documentation.
Okay.
And I can't say that they are linked particularly with certain communities and not with other, because I didn't have end this this work.
Yeah, I definitely understand. So I had just in case you had an answer, I would have insisted much more in a very specific question going on that. So I will have to wait for the publication of this paper and later the thesis. So I will keep with my doubt about this doubt and how this affected the. No, it's I think it's perfectly understandable, and I can wait to say it well done. So if there are no more questions, I think we can end it here and in the wait for for the publication. Okay, we have a question actually.
No, actually, it's not really a question because I know quite well the work of Laure.
Okay.
No, I just wanted to apologize because my camera is not working on Teams. I don't know why, but I was very interested by the presentation and specifically by the maps because it make it real. I mean, you know, the peculiarity of Montpellier and the difficult situation of Montpellier between different jurisdictions and so on. So you can easily realize it with maps that are very clear. And I didn't see these maps yet. Well, not all of them. So I can appreciate the work of Laure on that. So
thanks.
So it was not really a question.
No problem. I think comments are well welcomed.
Yes.
So merci, and we will see. see you again.
Yes.
You and everyone who's watching the YouTube video in the next session, which will take place next month, and afterwards with a discussion in the round table, which is to be presented by Rosario Costas. Thank you again.
Thank you.
That's your cool.
Goodbye.